National war. Beginning with the French Revolution, the hearts of the soldiery became part of the armory of battle, and as Foch puts it, war grew fierce and tragic. This does not mean that it thereupon became possible for any individual soldier to decide a war, provided he was sufficiently heroic. Only that the collective emotions came into play, what one may dare call the passionate might of the nation. The Romantic poets had a notable share in the wars of emancipation which Prussia fought against Napoleon, and the essentially passionate philosophies of thinkers like Fichte and Hegel were the earliest reinforcements of German nationalism. That is why the wars of the 19th century became more and more bloody. It was no longer rival interests that came into conflict, but antagonistic religions. And unlike interests, religions do not compromise. Instead, they exact a heroic death. At all times, religious wars have been by far the most violent. And yet, although this is true as regards the first 3/4 of the century, and above all of the period from 1848 to 1870, following the latter date, national passions were provisionally appeased, and for 40 years they gave place to capitalistic and commercial enterprise. Violence was still resorted to in the name of the nation, but material advantages were undoubtedly what ruled. Foch insists on this very well in his Principles de la Guerre. Quote, war, he says, became national in the first instance for the sake of winning and securing the independence of peoples, that of the French in 1792 to 93, of the Spaniards in 1804 to 14, of the Russians in 1812, of the Germans in 1813, and of Europe in 1814. At this stage, it produced those glorious and powerful displays of popular passion known as Valmy, Saragossa, Tarancon, Moscow, and Leipzig. War then went on being national for the sake of winning unity of races or nationality. This is what the Italians and the Prussians claimed to be fighting for in 1866 and 1870. In its name also, the King of Prussia, after he had become German emperor, put forward a title to the German provinces of Austria. But if war is still national today, 1903, it is for the sake of securing economic benefits and profitable trade agreements. After having been the violent means whereby peoples wrested a place in the world for themselves, which made them into nations, war has become the means to which they still resort in order to enrich themselves. Trade follows the flag. The colonial era was the last period of peace that Europe can be said to have deserved. I have already pointed out that in manners and in literature, this era was characterized by a final attempt to mythologize passion. The reaction does not bear comparison with chivalry, although its social purpose was the same, because it was adapted to the present scale of society. What now inspired convention and the formality of our behavior was no longer any spiritual principle, but calculations of private advantage, which cannot supply the community with a stout armature. The very nation being invoked had lost its romantic prestige. The flag protected the interests of the state, not the passions or honor of the best elements in the body social. And the office of the state was now no more than the honorific one of a board of directors. It made war in behalf of banks, as in the case of the conquest of Madagascar. In short, colonial warfare was but an extension of capitalistic competition in a form that laid a heavier burden on the country at large, though not on the great business firms. Towards the end of the 19th century, love, I mean that abstract and striking thing, unreal but significant, the average of typical expressions of love in a given period, as unreal and as significant, whether ugly or beautiful, whether at the end of the 19th century or during the famous century of Louis XIV, whether vicious or virtuous. There are signs which are not a particular period itself. Every period contains some of everything, but which belong to one period rather than to another. That is all I mean. Towards the end of the 19th century, love among the middle classes had become a most curious medley of nervous sentimentality and of regard for dividends and dowries. As it still is today in matrimonial advertisements, pure sex, if it happened to intrude, could only cloud these petty schemings and mass-produced noble sentiments in the same way as a drop of water clouds absinthe. War, likewise, had become a compound into which entered, on the one hand, the working up of popular opinion, what was the revanche for 1870 to 71, but a piece of national sentimentality. On the other hand, the ambitions of businessmen and financiers. The true warlike element had to provide for itself surreptitiously. War was growing middle class. Blood was getting commercialized. Army men already seemed anomalous to the realists. and to women and idle gapers a kind of thrilling survival. The attitude was that of democracies on the occasions when they grow excited over a royal wedding. Yet it was being generally supposed that the tremendous potential of frenzy and slaughter which had been piled up in Europe as a result of the cultivation of passion for centuries could be disposed of without incurring havoc. The War of 1914 was a most impressive consequence of this disregard for the myth. 10. Total war. With the Battle of Verdun in 1916, which the Germans called the Materialschlacht, or Battle of War Material, it must seem that the resemblance instituted by chivalry between the modes of love and war came to an end. No doubt it had always been the concrete aim of war to overcome the enemy's resistance by destroying his armed might, to force a woman's resistance by seducing her as peace, to do so by violating her as war. It must seem that the resemblance instituted by chivalry between the modes of love and war came to an end. No doubt it had always been the concrete aim of war to overcome the enemy's resistance by destroying his armed might, to force a woman's resistance by seducing her as peace, to do so by violating her as war. But the nation it was sought to defeat was not thereby destroyed. All that collapsed were its defenses. Victory was determined by pitched battles against the professional army, the investing of fortresses, the capture of a commander. In short, by a system of exact rules, the application of which was in consequence an art. And the victor triumphed over what was alive, a country or a people, either of which could be an object of desire. The whole face of war was thus changed with the introduction of the material and inhuman methods employed at Verdun. For as soon as war, from having been merely military, becomes a total war, the destruction of armed resistance means the wiping out of the whole live might of the enemy, the workmen incorporated in factories, the mothers who are begetting future soldiers, in short, the whole of the means of production. Things and persons lumped together. War is no longer the rape, but the murder of the hostile and coveted object of desire. Verdun, moreover, was but the preamble of this new kind of war, for there the process was confined to the methodical destruction of 1 million soldiers, and no civilians. But it was a Kriegspiel that allowed the final touches to be put to an instrument which is now able to operate on a far wider scale against areas such as London, Paris, or Berlin. That is to say, not against cannon fodder, but against the flesh and blood manufacturing the cannon, an instrument of obviously much more far-reaching effect. The technique of dealing death from afar has no equivalent in any imaginable code of love. Total war eludes both man and instinct. It turns upon passion, its begetter. And it is this, not the scale of the massacres, that is new in the history of the world. This suggests 3 remarks. War arose in the country, and in connection with fighting it has been customary down to the present time to speak of campaigns and of fields. But since 1914, we have witnessed the urbanization of war. The First Great War provided a large portion of the peasant masses of Europe with their introduction to mechanical civilization. It was a kind of conducted tour of a world exhibition of death-dealing arts and industries, with daily demonstrations upon live subjects. The effect of this general enlistment of the mechanized means of destruction was to neutralize the actual passion for war in the hearts of fighting men. The assuaging of violence and bloodshed gave place to mass brutality, and rival hordes were hurled at one another, not by the impulse of passionate frenzy, but in obedience to the calculating brains of engineers. Henceforth, man was no more than the servant of matter. He himself became a material, and one that is more effective the less human it is in its individual reflexes. In this way, notwithstanding the drug effect of propaganda, victory came to depend ultimately on the laws of mechanics rather than on the forecasts of psychology. The fighting instinct was thwarted. From 1914 to 1919, the explosion of sex, which had usually accompanied huge armed struggles, could only occur among civilians at the rear. In war, despite efforts in official quarters and on the part of certain popular writers and photographers to spread a high-flown sentimentality, a soldier's coming on leave was now simply the onrush of a male obsessed by an enforced continence that had lasted too long. Countless doctors and soldiers testified to the way in which a war of material was accompanied by a sex disaster. Cf. Sittengeschichte des Weltkriegs, 2 volumes, Vienna and Leipzig, 1930, the results of an inquiry by the late Magnus Hirschfeld and 12 other German doctors. A widespread impotence, or at least its premonitory symptoms, chronic onanism and homosexuality, was the result vouched for by statistics of a sojourn of 4 years in the trenches. That is how it came about that presently, for the first time, there was a general revolt of soldiers against war. The modern Landsknecht, realizing that this total war is the negation of the passion for war, embarked upon absurd adventures which he sought precisely because they were absurd and inhuman. Notably the novels of Ernst Junger, A Chronicle from the Trench Warfare of 1918, London 1930, etc., and of Ernst von Salomon. Because war, from being an outlet for the passions, had become a kind of vast castration of Europe. Total war thus implied the discarding of every accepted mode of fighting. Beginning with 1920, all the diplomatic fuss of ultimatums and declarations of war ceased to have currency. Hostilities were no longer brought solemnly to a close by the signing of treaties. The arbitrary distinction between open and fortified towns, civilians and soldiers, authorized and unauthorized means of destruction, all disappeared. It follows that the defeat of a country could no longer be symbolical or metaphorical. That is, be confined to certain agreed signs, but had actually to be its death. Here again we see that once the notion of rules is discarded, war can no longer be an act of rape between nations. It must be a sadistic crime, the possession of a dead victim, and hence in fact a non-possession. It can no longer exhibit a normal sexual instinct or even the passion that employs and transcends this instinct, but only that, as we have seen, irresistible perversion of passion, the, quote, castration complex, end of quote. The transplanting of passion into politics. Games require to be played on an enclosed ground. When the field of war, from being such a ground, the lists decorated with symbols, became a bombardment sector, passion was ousted from it, and passion thereupon sought and found other means of expression. Moreover, it was driven to do so by as much as anything the weakening of private and moral powers of resistance and by the altered nature of war. On the one hand, manners in democratic countries have grown so flexible as not to tend any longer to set up absolute obstructions such as intensify passion. On the other hand, the totalitarian system of breaking in the young tended to banish from private life every kind of internal tragic experience and ambiguous emotion. Lawlessness in manners and authoritarian hygienics operated to roughly the same effect. The human need of passion was thwarted, whether hereditary or acquired through culture. Its intimate and personal impulsions were enfeebled by such regimentation. Love between the wars became a curious medley of anxious intellectualism. A number of novels in the 1920s depicted dread and the middle-class defiance of restrictions and of materialism, what Germans call the Neue Sachlichkeit. It was clearly recognized that romantic passion could no longer obtain the ingredients necessary to sustaining its myth, could no longer select means of resistance in the midst of an atmosphere charged with tempestuous and secret devotion, a pathological fear of falling in love in a simple, straightforward manner and of suffering deceptions of the heart, together with a feverish hankering after experiences, formed the climate of the chief novels in vogue. The unambiguous significance of this was the individual relations of the sexes had ceased to be the most appropriate theater for passion to occur in. Passion, it seemed, was being detached from its concomitant. We entered upon a period of wandering libidos in quest of new spheres of activity. The first to offer itself was that of politics. The mass politics practiced since 1917 are simply an extension of total war by other means, if I may be allowed to convert Clausewitz's definition of war as, quote, diplomacy carried on by other means, end of quote. The political use made of the term front at once shows this. Moreover, a totalitarian state is but the state of war being prolonged and renewed, and then made permanent in a nation. But if total war abolished the merest possibility of passion, politics transferred individual passions to the level of the collective being. Everything that a totalitarian education withheld from individuals was heaped upon the personified nation. It is the nation or the party that had passions. It is the nation or the party that took over the whole interplay of exciting obstructions, ascesis, and the rush made unwittingly towards a heroic and therefore divinizing death. Whereas within and at the bottom, personal problems were now sterilized. Externally and on top, the passionate potential was being intensified daily. Eugenics took control of the morality that concerns the citizens of a state, and eugenics are a rational negation of any kind of private experience. Yet this only served to increase the tension of the whole personified in the nation. The nation-state said to the Germans, beget children, and that was a negation of passion. But it also said to its neighbors, there are too many of us within our frontiers, I must therefore have more territory. And this was a new passion, hence all the tensions abolished at the bottom were heaped on the top. Unmistakably, when rival wills to power confront one another, and there were already several totalitarian states, they are bound to clash passionately. Each becomes for some other an obstruction. The real tacit and inevitable aim of the totalitarian elevation was therefore war, and war means death. Furthermore, as happened with passionate love, not only was this aim vigorously denied by those concerned, but also it actually was unconscious. Nobody dared to say, I want war, any more than in passionate love the lovers said, we want death. Nevertheless, everything being done hastened the attainment of this aim, and everything that was being excited could only find its true significance in war. There is abundant evidence of this novel resemblance between politics and passion. The restraints which the state imposes in the name of the nation's greatness result in a collective ascesis. The umbrageous susceptibility of totalitarian nations is the equivalent of a knight's honor. And moreover, let me stress one striking feature. The masses respond to the dictator in a particular country in the same way as the women of that country respond to the tactics of suitors.